Buen dia, Gen Max. Today, we are going to be talking about all the different ways that I have tried to learn Spanish and where I've been successful and where I've been not so successful, so that you can see the multiple ways that you could learn Spanish too, and maybe learn a little bit from my experience, what might work well for you. So I'm here in Todo Santos at Hablamos Mexicano. It is a small school here in the centro of Todo Santos. And this is something that some folks who were in one of my videos mentioned. This is where they studied Spanish together. And so I thought, well, you know, I'm here in Todo Santos for a couple of weeks. Let me take some classes. And actually, I took 3 2-hour classes. And so they offer 1 and 2 hour classes, and they're one-on-one. You know, one-on-one classes work really well for me. That's kind of why I'm starting with this at the top of the video. And they offer them at 1 or 2 hours. And so I decided I wanted to be kind of intense here and do 2 hours. Now, the best thing, of course, is to go like all in intensive, multiple hour classes during the day and then do a homestay. I don't think they do that here, but I know they did it in Guatemala, where Kat and I first started learning Spanish together, was down in Panajachel. So we did a couple hours of class a day. So it was actually 2 students and 1 teacher. So we were learning together. And then there was a possibility to sign up for a homestay, which is best, especially if you do it alone and you are just immersed. And that is the best way to learn. I've heard of a study that said that adults are actually better at learning a language than kids are, because we already know one language. We can just kind of translate it into an additional language. But the difference is adults only try learning for, you know, if you're doing Duolingo, for example, that might be just 3 minutes a day. Whereas kids are learning for every waking hour, they're learning language. And that's what a intensive experience where you're living with a family, that's what that can give you, is that experience of learning with your adult mind, but the way a kid does every waking hour. So you could do that for a week, you could do that for a month. And I haven't done it myself, but I've heard really great things about learning that way. So I've also taken classes one-on-one in Oaxaca, and I'll try to list as many of these places down below as I can. And then the second in-person thing that you could do is group lessons. We did this in Atlanta, and that was pretty good too. And one of the benefits of doing kind of lessons and not just Duolingo or something like that is that you can get homework. One thing I've been struggling with is having conversations. Even though I'm here in Mexico, in order for this stuff to really sink into your brain, you need to practice it outside of class. And it's kind of hard to have like a really slow conversation with someone here, you know, outside of a school, with someone like in a restaurant or something where you're going into the past tense or the future tense, or some things that are a little more complicated than just being able to order off the menu and have some of that transactional Spanish, which is kind of the first Spanish you learn as a foreigner living in Mexico. But that's what homework can give you. Homework can give you a way to think about this in the time that you're not in class. Now, when you're learning this as an individual one-on-one lessons, of course, they move at your pace, and that can be good or bad depending on what your pace is. And of course, you can ask your teacher to kind of push you a little bit, but it's really going to depend on how much you're absorbing, how much homework you're doing, how much you're practicing outside of class, whether or not you go from one lesson to repeating a lot of that information in the next lesson, or go on to new information so that you can learn a new concept each time you come in for a class. And I mentioned group lessons like we did in Atlanta. There are lots of group lessons down in Mexico. So you can work with teachers individually in Mexico. You can hire a tutor, essentially, or you can get into a class. So typical classes might be, you know, 5 or 10 people, maybe 200 pesos, so $10 or something for an hour, hour and a half. And they can be a lot of fun. Fun way to learn, but you're kind of learning at the speed of the entire class. So that can be somewhat frustrating if you're a more advanced learner. But I think really what it's going to come down to, the message at the end of this video, is going to be that you need multiple ways to learn, or at least I need multiple ways to learn. You can't just rely on one method all on its own. So being able to do individual lessons and group lessons and something like Duolingo or something would be a good combination. One way of learning that I really like is Intercambios. And I know they have these in La Paz. We did these in Atlanta when we were in a school. And this is where students get together, students who are learning English get together with students who are learning Spanish and have conversations in both languages. And it's great because you see where the native Spanish speaker struggles with English. Like, for instance, they say to take a decision. And so when they're translating it there, that's what they're saying in English. And you're like, oh, no, it means make a decision. But then you realize, well, when I say it in Spanish, I need to use the word for to take a decision, not to make a decision. So they also are a great way to meet locals who are learning English so that you can practice your language and form friendships beyond just the gringo community. So I want to cover probably the most common one, the most common way to learn Spanish that I hear people talk about, and that is Duolingo. And I used to be really down on Duolingo until I started doing it. And I found that it's not so bad. The problem is that people rely on it 100% as the way they learn Spanish. So I have the free version, and the free version is limited to maybe 15 minutes a day if you can eke out 15 minutes before you run out of gems or whatever, or run out of hearts or something. So it's very gamified, but it makes you want to play the game every day because you don't want to lose your streak. Everyone says, I've been on Duolingo for 1,000 days or 250 days or whatever it is. So it's set up to make you want to continue. Now, just so you know, if you're going to start out, you do have streak freezes, which is where if you skip a day accidentally or on purpose, it will continue counting your days. It'll just kind of put you on pause for up to 2 days at a time, I think. This doesn't have to cause you a lot of anxiety about losing your streak if you miss a day. Now, with Duolingo, to be able to count as having worked out that day or thought that day, you can do something for as little as 4 minutes, maybe even less than that. So it's a really low lift to be able to get a day's worth of learning in. And back to the idea of adults can learn better than kids if they just spent the time doing it. You can't really expect to learn a lot when you're only working on it for 4 minutes a day. But with the free version, there is a limit of about 15 minutes. So if you want to pay, you can use it more. So it would be a more helpful tool if you are willing to pay for it. And if you're not willing to pay for it, you're going to have to watch a lot of ads, especially on the mobile. It's gotten a little bit better about letting you skip those ads. There's always, after 10 seconds or something, there's a little X or something that you can use to skip ahead and skip the ads. But they typically make it really small, especially for my 50-some-year-old eyes. So the app is well designed. I mean, they've definitely got this down in terms of how to have different ways of learning, being reading, being listening, being typing out something. It's definitely a good way to learn vocabulary. What it's not a good way to learn is grammar. They really don't help you out with explaining grammar. And that's where the next software that I tried comes in, and that's Babbel. And Babbel is very similar to Duolingo. I think they don't give you nearly as much for free. And I did buy Babbel. I think it was $25 a month or something, and I bought it for 3 or 4 months. What I found is the minimum amount of time per day that you spend to be able to play the game and get a streak going is 15 seconds or something like that. You can go in and learn one new word, the word of the day, and that can count as, having learned that day. But of course, you need to dig deeper. And when I did dig deeper, I found that it went a little bit too fast for me. So I would have to repeat a lesson multiple times, which is kind of boring, before I could really get a concept. And then what I found is I was not wanting to do it. So I would go in and learn one word and be able to continue my streak. And then I just stopped doing it completely. And then after a couple of months, I stopped paying for it. But I think if you're going to be committed, Babbel is probably a better way to learn grammar and learn the entire language than Duolingo. Now, Pimsleur is something that's been around for a long time, and I gave that a try, and it didn't really work for me. It seems to be more laid out for auditory learners, and I need a combination of visual and auditory. I need to be able to practice. I almost need to be able to touch the words to be able to get them. So it wasn't a good one for me, but if you're an auditory learner, it could be good for you. So you'd spend 30 minutes a day, and it had a good motivational system to get you to spend that time. And I think 30 minutes a day is a reasonable amount of time to spend to learn a language. Of course, once again, comparing you to a kid who's learning a language, you're spending 30 minutes a day, not 16 hours a day. So just set your expectations accordingly. but I didn't find this to be super good at learning grammar, at understanding why something works a certain way. You just have to accept that that's the way it works. I tried something called Promova and it just didn't seem legit, so I canceled that right away. Now, YouTube is a great tool for learning another language. And as I mentioned, it's a good add-on. It's not the only thing you should be doing, but I like reading stories, listening to stories, and it just helps you really process the vocabulary. So this gets beyond just the time you spend learning, but this is like implementing it into everyday life if you can't have conversations with people. So a couple of YouTube channels that I like, one is Extr, and that is an old, very old, it's like Friends. It's like a TV show that is in Spanish. That's in relatively easy Spanish, a little bit cheesy, but it is definitely a good way to learn and practice your Spanish. Also, Dreaming Spanish. This is a YouTube channel, but also a website. So you can go in there and say like what you want. It's just stories in different languages, but they set the language or the level. So you can go in there and listen to stories at a beginner level or an intermediate level or an advanced level. You can try stories from different countries. So if you want to learn Mexican Spanish versus Argentinian Spanish, you can do that. Listen ES is a great channel that has kind of cartoons, and they're just short stories that go through 3 times. One time with Spanish subtitles, then with English subtitles, and then without subtitles. I found those to be pretty helpful, at least for learning beginner Spanish. And there are channels like QRuPaul has more like grammar channels, or Nate with Fluent Spanish Speakers Academy. These are great channels that just kind of give you the grammar lessons, and you can also buy into classes with them. So that is an option. I tried out Nate's classes and they were good. It didn't have that day-to-day motivation that something like Duolingo had, or something like buying a class and with a teacher, or where there was kind of a meetup every week to learn something new. He does have, I think, monthly meetups to meet with him. And then he had like a conversation group that met online. So there was a little bit of camaraderie with the different students in Nate's meetup or Nate's classes. But it wasn't right for me. So he has some PDFs that you can download, and there are some flashcards and things like that, but it didn't work as well. It's a small business class. It's not something like Duolingo, which has all these software engineers working behind the scenes to make it really foolproof. QRuPaul also, I've heard great things about his classes, and I've watched some of his videos online, and I believe that he would be a good teacher. I kind of like these teachers who are English as their first language. It's interesting. They kind of teach the way they learned. So it's maybe a little bit different than working with a native Spanish speaker. But if you've taken QRuPaul's class, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. There are also podcasts in Spanish. So when I'm alone in the car, I like to listen to podcasts, and Spanish podcasts are great. So a couple of those podcasts are News in Slow Spanish. I haven't bought this version where you get to hear all the news, but you do get like 2 minutes of news in slow Spanish if you subscribe without paying. So that is helpful, but I have found myself not listening to that as much because it always gets cut off pretty quickly into the episode. The Duolingo Spanish podcast is great because it's a mix of both English and Spanish. So they're telling a story and going back and forth between 2 speakers. So if you get a little bit lost in the story during the Spanish part, you can catch up during the English part. And then there's another one called Coffee Break Spanish, which is essentially a teacher and a student going over classes. So it's starting out at a beginner level, and I found that to be pretty helpful. So I watched that or listened to that for quite a while, but then I kind of fell off of that too. So there's a website called ITalki, which I've used a couple of times, once to find a Spanish tutor online and once to do a conversation partner. So we set up multiple dates with each of these people, and you pay for like a block of 6 lessons or something like that, or 6 conversations in a half an hour or an hour. And these are just all kind of individual people who just set themselves up on the platform. Just one note that the The low price that you see up front is for a introductory lesson, and usually the lessons go up in price a little bit after that. But this is great if you want to have those conversations with someone who's going to be really forgiving of how slow you speak when you're trying to really work these things out. But when you're trying to work these things out, that's when you're building that neural network in your head. So having those conversations like that is super helpful. So I can highly recommend ITalki as a resource for practicing your Spanish. Now, the last one that I used was Lingoda. And that is online small group Spanish lessons. So you could go in and say, I want to learn about, the preterite tense or something. And I want to learn on Wednesday night, and I want to learn from someone who's in Mexico. So it's a really great system. And they're all teaching the exact same curriculum. So you can go through, if you could take a lesson, you can take a lesson multiple times, but you're paying by the lesson. And it's a really well-designed software. So if group lessons are something that you want to look into and you want to do it online, I can highly recommend Lingoda. So those are the different ways. I'm sure there have been other ways that I've tried to learn Spanish. I actually use Google Translate a little bit, but I don't use it in the middle of a conversation. I usually use it when I know that I'm going to have a conversation about something. I'll prep myself with Google Translate and then go out and have the conversation. So those are just some of the ways that I've learned Spanish. So how are you learning Spanish, and what's working for you? What's working best for me is a combination of Duolingo and the ITalki practice lessons, the videos in Spanish, and taking one-on-one classes when I can. So those are what's working best for me. What's working well for you? Tell me down below. If you want to check out any of these resources that I've mentioned, you'll find links down below. So from Todo, Santos, Mexico, wish you were here. Hasta luego.